Day, everybody. Today we'll be doing our advanced writing, right? It's basically high school advanced writing on point of view. So we're doing our high school advanced writing on point of view, and we'll specifically focus on grade 8, right? And before we start, we're going to log on to aplusstudents.ca. Once you've logged on to aplusstudents.ca, you're going to log on to You're going to log in with the username as well as your password. Select the subject, which is English Language Arts. And then, as much as this is high school, we are going to go to the grade 8 tutorial. So we're going to select grade 8. And then scroll down up until we get to grade 8 point of view. All right, so we're doing point of view. So the chapter that we are focusing on is point of view, which is advanced writing, English Language Arts, grade 8. And the lessons that we're going to be focusing on under the chapter of point of view is to identify the narrative point of view. All right, so now we're going on to a lesson on point of view, right? So a narrator of a story is the voice that is telling, right? Or narrating the story. So when it comes to either story writing, storytelling, right? Then of course the narrator of a story. It is either the voice of the telling or the voice that is telling, sorry, or that is narrating the story. So it's telling the story or narrating the story, right? And a narrator's point of view is the perspective from which a story is told. Because you can have different characters, right? And when it comes to the character, then the characters basically just focus on that specific character that they play. Whereas when it comes to the narrator gives us an overall perspective of the whole story. It gives us the point of view of the whole story plus of each one of the characters. So narrator's point of view is the perspective from which a story is told. So the story is being told from the narrator's perspective, not just from the one or two or three characters that is basically playing or acting. So there are three main points of view, right? We have first person, and then we have in second person, and then we have in third person. So when it comes to in first person, right? So in first person, the narrator describes events from his or her own perspective. So in first person, the narrator, it describes events from his or her own perspective, right? So he's telling the story or narrating the story. But in first person, he or she is basically describing the events that is taking place within the story in his or her own perspective. And in first person narrators, they use first person pronouns. And when they use first person pronouns, then they use pronouns such as I, me, we, and they use us. So we see that the first person narrators, they use first person pronouns such as I, me, we, and us. So it's them giving this perspective on the story, on the characters, right? But in a first person perspective. You'll hear them using words like I, me, we, or they use words like us. And if we look at an example, right, of first person, let's say narrating or perspective, it says, I waded slowly across the river. So I waded slowly across the river, holding my backpack high above the water. Then we have second person, right? So we said first person or in first person, then the narrator uses words like I, me, we, or us, which is the pronouns. And the narrator describes events from his or her own perspective, and that is first person narrating. But now we have in second person. And in second person, the narrator casts the reader as a character in the story. So in second person, the narrator casts the reader as a character in the story. So in second person, we say that the narrator casts the reader as a character in the story. And second person narrators, they use second person pronouns. And second person pronouns are words such as you and your. So in second person pronoun, we use words like you and we use words like your. So when it comes to the second person, right? For example, if we look at an example, it says, you turn the page in anticipation, eager to find out where the story will lead. So once again, in the second person, the narrator casts the reader as a character in the story, and we use the pronouns such as you and your. And we made an example of you turn the page in anticipation, eager to find out where the story will lead. So that word you. So you turn the page in anticipation, eager to find out where the story will lead. So you, it gives us indication that this is the second person narrating, right? Then we have in third person, right? So we went over first person, which is the narrator's own perspective on things. And we use words like I, me, we, us, right? And then we have second person, which is the narrator casts the reader as a character in the story. And we use words like you and your. And now we have the third person, right? And in the third person, the narrator describes events from the perspective of an outside observer. So in third person, the narrator describes events from the perspective of an outside observer. And third person narrators, they use third person pronouns. And third person pronouns are he, she, him, and her. And sometimes they even use the character's name, like instead of just using pronouns, they would use the character's names. And also when it comes to the third person, right? With third person limited point of view, the observer's knowledge is limited to what a single character knows and feels. So we said that in third person, the narrator describes events from the perspective of an outsider, right? And we use the third person pronouns such as he, she, him, and her. And we also sometimes use the characters' names, right? And then we also have third person limited point of view. That is where the observer's knowledge is limited to what a single character knows and feels. For example, Maria wondered whether her new neighbor's laugh was genuine. So, with third person, right, omniscient point of view, the observer is all knowing and often reveals multiple characters' thoughts and feelings. So, not just one, but multiple. And another example is Bernard was confident that the model rocket would launch without a hitch, but Nina had her doubts. And as you can see with both examples that are made, right, they mentioned Maria and they mentioned Bernard or Nina, right? Because in third person, you can either use the pronouns or you can call the character by name. All right, so this is basically point of view where we have first person, second person, and third person, right? And when it comes to point of view, the narrator of a story is once again the voice that is telling or narrating the story. And a narrator's point of view is the perspective from which a story is being told. And remember, like I said earlier on, the narrator is like the main person within a story because the narrator, it basically knows characters of each one. It basically, let's say, it describes the characters of each one. And we see that there are three main points of view, which is in first person, in second person, and in third person. And once again, in first person, the narrator describes events from his or her own perspective. And in the second person, the narrator casts the reader as a character in the story. And in third person, the narrator describes events from the perspective of an outsider or an observer. All right, so we need to identify the narrator's point of view, right? And we say that the narrator in the story or the narrator of the story is the one that is telling or narrating the story. And we are basically going on the narrator's point of view, which is the perspective from which the story is told. All right, so we explained first person, second person, and third person. So now, if we look at this passage, it says, which point of view does the narrator use within the passage? So we either going to say if he's using the first person, if he's using the second person, or if he's using the third person. So Ted Cole's children's book were of more intellectual and psychological and even emotional interest to Eddie than the novels were. A cautionary tale for children came naturally to Ted. He could imagine and express their fears. He could satisfy children. Had Thomas and Timothy lived into adulthood, they would doubtless have been disappointed in their father. It was only as an adult that Ruth Cole would be disappointed in Ted. As a child, she loved him. So if we read that story or the passage, so we need to, based on this passage, we need to say if it's first person, if it's in second person, or if it's in third person. And remember, we said in first person, it is the narrator's point of view. We said in the second person, it is basically where the readers they cast um the narrator casts the reader as a character in the story. And in third person, the narrator describes events from the perspective of an outsider. And in this case, the narrator uses the perspective of the reader or the perspective of an outsider. So this is third person. So we can say this story is, or this passage is third person. So third person. All right. So we need to say now which point of view does the narrator use within this passage? He himself, he himself was a very old man with shaggy white hair, which grew over most of his face as well as on his head. And he liked him almost at once. But on the first evening when he came out to meet them at the front door, he was so odd looking that Lucy, who was the youngest, was a little afraid of him. And Edmund, who was the next youngest, wanted to laugh. And if we look at this passage, right, he himself, this sounds more as if it is written within the third person, especially where they are naming characters by name. For example, Lucy, Edmund, right? So we can then say this is third person. So this is third person. And then we're doing the last one before we go on to the test. So which point of view does the narrator use within the passage? So when you find your seat, you glance at the businessman sitting next to you and decide is almost handsome. This is the second leg of your trip from Miami to Casablanca, and the distance traveled already has muted the horror of the last 2 months. So when you find your seat, you glance at the businessman sitting next to you and decide he's almost handsome. All right. So we need to say whether this is in first person, whether it is in second person, or whether it is in third person. So if we look at the narrator's point of view in this one, right? Then we can say it is the second person. So we can say this is in the second person, and it is basically where the narrator casts the reader as a character within the story. So it's second person. But all right, let's go to our test. So we need to say which point of view does narrator use within the passage. Jessica stepped into the room, closed the door, and stood with her back to it. My son lives, she thought. My son lives and is human. Paul looked at his mother. She told the truth. He wanted to get away alone and think this experience through, but he knew he could not leave until he was dismissed. So is this in the first person, in the second person, or in the third person? They're naming characters. All right, so if we look at the passage, right, and then we can say this is in third person, especially since they are naming characters by name. And it is the third person. All right, so which point of view does the narrator use within the passage? It says that I like the sound of Rowdy's laughter or Rowdy's laughter. I don't hear it very often, but it's always sort of this avalanche of ha ha and ho ho and he. I like to make him laugh. He loves my cartoons. He's a big, goofy dreamer, too, just like me. I like the sound, right? And the word I gives us an indication that this is first person. So we see words like I, me. Yes, so first person. All right, so Jonas went to his own desk and began to sort through his school papers for the evening's assignment. But his mind was still on December and the coming ceremony. Though he had been reassured by the talk with his parents, he hadn't the slightest idea what assignments the elders would be selecting for his future, or how he might feel about it when the day came. So we need to say this in the first person, second person, third person. And they're calling characters by name, so we can maybe say this is the third person. Example, Jonah is being mentioned. And third person is correct. So third person point of view is correct. So they worked together for an hour or more without speaking. Ellen was grave and absorbed in the anxious thoughts of that spring. Jethro was accustomed to adapting himself to the behaviors and moods of older people, and he found enough in the world about him to occupy his interest as he worked. And if we look at this one, they use words like they as well as calling the person, the characters by name. So we can maybe say this is the third person. And that is correct. So third person. All right. Here you come. Better late than never. A face presentation, not the boy your father so desperately wanted, but here you come anyway. All 6 pounds, 3 ounces of you, button nose, conical head, good color. And if we look at this, right, it's not first person, because first person uses words like I or me. It's not third person, because third person will specifically make mention of the characters. So we can say this is in second person. And second person is correct. but it ate him. But they were going to do, but that what were they going to do proved nothing. So again, but oh, Brian shrugged, but it ate him. What they were going to do proved nothing. They were playing a game and it struck him that Derek did that. His whole life was that. He knew it was unfair to think of the man that way. He didn't, after all, know him very well. But he acted that way, like it was all a game. And Derek was approaching the whole business that way. And if we look at which point of view it is, we can say it's third person, specifically looking at the wording like Brian, Derek, naming the characters. So, third person. Ted Cole's children's book were of the most intellectual and psychological and even emotional interest to Eddie that the novels were. A cautionary tale for children come naturally to Ted. He could imagine and express their fears, and he could satisfy children. And we can say this one is third person. Ted Cole, third person. And third person is correct. So it is June 1959. You are 12 years old, and in 1 week, you and your sixth grade classmates will be graduation from the grammar school you have attended since you were 5. All right, so if we look at this one, right? Where were we? We said in June, it is June 1959. You are 12 years old, and in 1 week, you and your sixth grade classmates will be graduation from the grammar school that you have attended since you were 5. And it is a splendid day, late spring in its most lustrous incarnation. Sunlight pouring from the cloudless blue sky, warm but not too warm, scant humidity, a soft breeze stirring the air and rippling over your face and neck and bare arms. And especially since they're using you all the time. For example, you are 12, you and your classmates, right? We can say this is in the second person. And second person is correct. The circus looked abandoned and empty, but you think perhaps you can smell caramel wafting through the evening breeze beneath the crisp scent of the autumn leaves. The people around you are growing relentless from waiting, a sea of shuffling feet, murmuring and abandoning their endeavors in search of some place warmer to pass through the evening. So if we look at this word, especially since you use words like you can smell, you are growing relentless, we can say this is the second person. And second person is correct. Back when I still walked home with Sal, it was easy to pretend that the laughing man didn't scare me because Sal was pretending too. He tried not to show it, but he freaked when he saw the laughing man shaking his fist at the sky and kicking his legs out into traffic. I could tell by the way Sal's face kind of froze. And if we look at words like I could tell, I know, I still walked home, we can say this is first person, right? And the last one we're going to say Ben's voice drawled on and on, thickened the food and drowsiness. He told of the big moose hunts of these days with the Indians. Listening, Matt couldn't make the man out. To hear him talk, he had been as big as a hero as the Jack of the Giant Killer, as Jack the Giant Killer. But he didn't look the part. He had certainly fallen on hard times of late. And no doubt about it, however, he could tell a goofy story. And if we look at the words, like for example, the namings that is used, right? Calling the characters by name, and then we say this is third person. And third person is correct. All right, so that is now point of view, right? And we said that when it comes to point of view, then the narrator of a story is the voice that is telling or narrating the story. And a narrator's point of view is the perspective from which a story is told. And we have three main points. We have the first person, second person, third person, right? And in the first person, the narrator describes events from his or her own perspective, right? And words such as I, me, we, and us are being used. All right. And then we have second person, which is the narrator casts the reader as a character in the story. And then we have third person is where the the narrator describes events from the perspective of an outsider, right? And either the narrator uses words like he, she, him, her, or in most cases, the narrator uses the characters' names. All right, so this is now the end of our lesson on point of view. Thank you very much for joining the class, and I really hope you're going to have a good day further. Goodbye.